You can try anything you want to shape the music, to change the color, to talk about balance, but the musicians might not respond 100%. You cannot adjust the balance exactly to how you want it. Hi there! Hello, hello! Welcome back to the 51st episode of the Conductor's podcast. Woo! We are in the 51st, and it's such a celebration and achievement. I wanted to thank my team who helped me when we started, and also my partner, now the podcast engineers who helps me doing all the editing. But I have to say, when I totally forgot that last week was our 50th episode because I always thought that was at 49. But now we are officially in the 11th month since our launch for August because we launched last year in October. But I'm so excited. I'm rumbling, so you could tell like how excited I am. And I can't imagine. I'm just so thankful and so grateful for all of you listening. No matter if you listen to every single episode or if you listen to just a few of them or you only listen to one because someone forwarded to you and you found it useful, that's the most important thing for me. I wanted you to have a chance to hear different people's stories and know that there isn't just one single version of success or a single version of the path to the podium because everyone is different. And if we only celebrate a stereotyped way of interpreting success, we are doomed. It's not what music is about. I don't think so. I think music is about sharing, and it's such a personal journey. And if you can take any one person with you in the journey, it's a success. So in today's episode, we are going to talk about score study. I know this is something that I briefly touched on last week or last summer mini series about, how I can get better. I talk about some tips that had worked for me or were given to me. And also in episode number 33 or the April Conductor's Podcast Wisdom series, I asked 10 people how they study the score. But I thought today would be a good chance to wrap up everything in a more systematic way to share about some tips that were given to me again and something that I found useful and put them into like one episode so you can find everything that you would need. So when we talk about score study, I wanted to emphasize how important this is, even though it might not look like from the outside that when people think about conducting, you think about going to rehearsals, speaking with your musicians, correcting things, making changes, or waving your arms, or looking at your musicians with different facial expressions. I had seen conductors with just those camera faces. They're always acting out. It looks great on photograph, but doesn't really provoke any music making. But anyways, there are a lot of outside things. But it really comes down to your score study. You can have various types of conducting techniques. You can be very clear or very vague. When you look at some of the famous maestros, some great conductors from the past, you will see, I don't get what they're beating. I can't find their beats, while the orchestra or the ensemble, the band, the choir still perform beautifully. It's because they have this deep knowledge of the music and they found a way to convey it. And that's the most important thing. You are transforming the sound by sharing your understanding of the music. So the understanding of the music needs to come first. It's the first and foremost, most important thing. Score study, score study, score study. In today's episode, I'm going to organize it in 3 parts. The first part I'm going to share with you if I have no time to properly prepare something and have to conduct very quickly, have to learn a piece very quickly, what are the big things that I go to? The second part would be if I have all the time I need in the world, when I have the chance to study a piece thoroughly, what are the tips that I used? Or I don't use all of them all the time. I will tell you a little more, but I think I would like to think it as a toolbox. And depending on the piece, depending on the ensemble, and depending on how much time you have or where you are in your journey, you might mix and match the different tools. And then I wanted to share some tips from our Girls Who Conduct guest. If you are following our social media, you will see that for a few months, Friday, our ambassadors had this Friday Discovery series, and various different conductors shared their tips, rehearsal strategies, or score study. So I wanted to share a few highlights and invite you to check them out. It's a great series, and our ambassadors and Helena and Amanda did a wonderful job. I just wanted to give them a shout out, and they are doing the work under the mentorship of our director, Johanna Lenny, and they are just awesome people to work with. Anyways, without further ado, we are going to jump in. What happens when I don't have time and have to learn a piece really quickly? This often happens with Pop's scores, Pop's concerts, holidays, movies, and it sometimes happens with contemporary music or new music because depending on the composer you're working with and also the publisher, sometimes you can't get the score ahead of time because of the rental contract or rental agreement. A lot of times I only get a score maybe a week before the rehearsal, or sometimes I have to study a few pieces if I'm jumping in one night, and the next day I will have to go into the concert, or just like with one rehearsal or without rehearsal. That's very often the scenario for, holidays or outreach or educational concert. So when you don't have enough time to study, the most important thing is tempo. The famous teacher, Johannes Schlaefli, who teaches at, I forgot where, I think he teaches at Zurich in Switzerland in Europe, once said to us when I attended a workshop with him that tempo is the only one thing that a conductor can really depict. He said, you can try anything you want to shape the music, to change the color, to talk about balance, but the musicians might not respond 100%. You cannot adjust the balance exactly to how you want it, or you cannot make sure that the musicians will play a certain piece to your liking. They might have their own interpretation, but as a conductor, tempo comes from you, and you have to be solely responsible for the tempo. They might be dragging or rushing, but you are the one starting it, controlling it, maintaining it, sustaining it, however you want to describe it. So tempo. And with tempo, it comes with transitions. When you have different sections with various tempos, there is transition. Is it an abrupt transition? You stop and then need to go to the next section very quickly, or is there no stopping and you have to suddenly change to a new tempo? Or are you getting faster or getting slower into the next tempo? All of them are the most important thing when you don't have enough rehearsal time and when you don't have enough time to study. Usually when this happens to me, I listen a lot. I would be listening and go crazy. And very often I try to find a way to help my body to memorize the tempo by kind of walking it or by feeling it, because tempo is a subjective feeling. When you are nervous or when you're stressed out, you might go faster. A lot of people do. Or my friend Susie Sider said her caffeine intake affects her feeling of tempo, so she needs to make sure that she always has the same amount of coffee when she's studying and also when she goes to rehearsal. Otherwise, when you have a different heart rate, everything feels differently. So I will listen a lot. And when practicing, I set metronomes of 2 different tempos and see how I can go from 1 to 2. So For example, if the first section is a beat to 60 and the second section is a beat to 108, and I have 8 bars in between to accelerando into the one, I'll set the first one and then just practice how I can smooth it out to the new section again and again, day and night, until I learn it to the point that you can wake me up in the middle of the night and I can still conduct it. That's how solid you need to be. Tempo is the most important thing. You need a roadmap. You need to know how you can start, which ways you need to take, and how you get to the end when you don't have enough time. If you have time after that, I always work on balance entrances and unification of style. So a lot of time you can find some keywords to talk about a style, such as let's make sure that the staccato notes are a little bit on the sharper side, so it's dry and cut, unless something happens differently. Or that's roll all the chords, everything needs to be round, so it's not pum, but rum kind of sound. You can describe that to your players or your singers. Say, okay, at a certain part, we need to make sure that we have a lot of support from your diaphragm, and with the high notes, really think about the phrase and go to the pick or go to the last note of each phrase. So some keywords of the stylistic unification and balance is the most important, because balance is something that your ensemble can't really know themselves. They might know that they are loud, or they sometimes don't even know because of where they sit in your ensemble. You have to tell them, gesture them, or tell them if they're not getting it from your gesture. Okay, we need a little more cello here, or we can have less trumpet here. We can have more clarinet in this session, more violas, that kind of thing. It can be gestured, but that's something that you have to think about when you are studying. There might be some balance problem here. These people haven't played after 100 bars or 10 minutes sitting there. I need to make sure that they are coming in with the entrances, and what are the stylistic goals that I'm going after. So these are the big things that I go to when I don't have enough time. Tempo, and transition. And with a lot of listening, trying to memorize the tempo, sometimes with helping, moving my body to see how it fits with my muscle memories. And then if I have time with rehearsal and with my study, I look at stylistic trait, balances, where might be balance problems, and entrances. Now, the second part, I'm going to talk about what if we have time? Well, so you know that you're going to conduct a piece in a month, that you have time to practice, to study. I will put a checklist, the show note. That is something that I adapted from the list that Ken Kiesler, the famous teacher at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, gave me, but I added something. So I would read through that checklist, but I was going to talk about some of the tips. The checklist has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 items. The first one is the text, breathing points, ranges, and vocal challenges if you're working with singers and vocalists. The second is the tempi, the tempo changes, transitions, and pacing. See, like this, the number one important thing. The next is transpositions, chordal and harmonic structures. Number 4, phrase types, length, and formal structure. Number 5, instrumentation and texture, who plays what when. Number 6, the dynamic plan of the piece and balance issues. Number 7, intonation, instrument tuning tendencies, ranges, and challenges. Bassoons, they tend to get a little higher on their pitch compared to their woodwind families, and flute has different tendency depending on which register, when they are lower or they are higher, they are a little different. Oboes tend to be a little sharper as well, things like that. Don't worry, I'll put that checklist on the show notes, and you can check out chaowenting.com/51 for show notes. But this is not what I'm going to talk to you today, because list is a little boring. I wanted to talk to you about some tips or some tools that I use. I usually mix and match them. I don't go through every single one of them for every piece, as I said before, because of the different pieces. They might require different knowledge. Some pieces are more complicated and their rhythmic writing. Some are more challenging for pacing. Some are more with the harmonic colors. It depends. Or sometimes I'm feeling better that with the formal structure because I might have done a lot of pieces from the same composer, so I know their languages quite well. So I don't need to go through so much details for certain things. But anyways, so the first 2 tips came from Professor Johannes Schlaefli, who I mentioned before. He talked to us about, 1, having a dynamic chart. What he meant was know what is the dynamic range that the composer uses. Sometimes a composer writes 3 pianos to 3 fortes all the time. It's either very loud or very soft. Or I once conducted a piece that the composer wrote mostly mezzo things. So she had mezzo forte and then mezzo piano and then mezzo forte and mezzo piano. I think there was only once that the piece goes to fortissimo and only maybe 3 times she goes to forte. She even didn't have pianissimo, if I remember correctly. So that means her mezzo forte is loud, her mezzo piano is soft. So I need to make sure that my players understood that her range is a little narrower. So when they see mezzo forte piano, it's not a little softer, it's her soft. So Schlaefli meant that you need to understand first what's the dynamic range. Does the composer write from piano to 3 fortes? Or, like 2 fortes to 5 pianos? What's the range? And where are the peaks? Where are the loudest places? It's not necessarily what's written as the loudest. If there are 5 different sessions of triple forte, one of them could be louder than the others because of the pacing and because it's a climax or because of the structure. Where are the louder places and where is the loudest? You have to kind of decide that and know how you're going. So I sometimes do that, especially with a composer that I'm less familiar with. I'll write down okay, so this section is from piano to mezzo, and you find some composers are less systematic, less consistent. They might be a little more casual. Some of them are really, really rigorous about how they place the dynamic markings, and it's also a way of learning about the composer's language. The second thing that Schlaefli talked to us when I was in a conducting workshop with him was to have 3 adjectives for each session that you are going to describe, and preferably in very simple plain Italian, especially when you are working with a foreign ensemble. This happens a little more in the orchestral world. So during the summertime, especially, but throughout the year, you might be going to a workshop in Europe, in Latin America, going to countries, work with ensembles whose primary language is not your primary language. So if saying that you are working with an ensemble in Romania or Bulgarian, some of them might know English a little bit, but when you speak fast and speak a lot, there might be some misunderstanding if your players are not as proficient. So he said the best way is to have simple Italian musical terms to describe each session that your foreign players will understand immediately. For example, you can say this part you want legato, dolce, and sottovoce. So that's easily understood. You want long lines, lyrical, you want softer sound and very sweet quality. So he advised us, especially when during the workshop setting, to be very efficient, and when you study, have 3 adjectives for every single session. So these 2 tips were coming from Professor Schlaefli. And the next one that I used a lot in my studying years was from Professor Mark Gibson at CCM, my teacher, when I did my master's. He, at some point, asked us to write out the harmony of every single chord as a practice and exercise. And his main idea is for you to have a cheat sheet to know what harmony is then there. So if you know it's a D major 7 or it's a diminished 7, or it's a diminished 5th, you know what notes are in there for that chord. And when you are correcting things in rehearsal, it helps you much quickly. So his theory is that, okay, if you hear something wrong, but you're not sure, and then you look down, okay, it's a C7 plus an extra note of F sharp. So you know what notes should be there, and when you tune them, and when you correct wrong notes, you know what notes should not be there. So he said you could either write in Roman numerals if that works for you. I used a more like kind of jazzy marking, so I don't write, instead of writing, oh, this is the 4th degree of this key, I write like D something or E9, or it's a combination of E major plus an F sharp minor chord, something like that for myself. So he did it as an exercise for his students, and like I think we were asked to write out every single chord for 1 or 2 pieces across a few months. I don't do that every single time, but I do still use this technique when there are transitional parts, or when things are modulating, or when the music goes through a series of different keys, like tonalization, or it's like going through a bunch of different keys, and I write that out. So that's something that I found interesting for exercise if you're still kind of at the beginning of your score study journey. That might be something fun to work, to find a small, like a short piece, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and write out every single harmony. And you will see how much you usually miss. So the next 2-3 things comes from Miguel Harth-Bedoya. So I did a workshop, like online workshop during the pandemic with him on score study, and he talks about some of the things that I knew, but I didn't put in as exercise or as a separate step in my own score study. So I'm going to share that with you here. The first that was new to me was to compare the reprise. What does that mean? So a lot of the music in the classical era, or even like kind of before and beyond, would have some materials repeated. Even if it's not in a sonata form, but some material will come back. So you are going to compare what's the difference when it comes back. Let's take a sonata form since it's easier to understand. In the exposition, let's say the first theme has 3 8-bar phrases. So the first thing has 24 bars, and then it went into a transition of 12 bars. So then you compare with the recapitulation. Oh, with recapitulation, does the first thing still comes in 3 sets of 8 bars? Oh, maybe no, this time there are only 2 sets of 8 bars, so now it's shortened into 16 bars. Or it's still 3 sets, but the third set is not 8 bars anymore, so it's now 8 plus 8 plus 7. There's something that pivoted differently. It's more easily understood in a sonata form because in the sonata form, the recapitulation stays in the same key for the second theme, right? So the modulation should be different. So then he will compare, okay, in the exposition, the transition going to the second theme was 12 bars. What happens in the recap? Oh, maybe because now we are staying in the main key, it's shortened. It's not only 9 bars, so there are 3 plus 3 plus 3. Or now we need a little more time, or the composer throw in some of the materials from the development session, so now it's a longer transition. He will ask us, how do we compare which part corresponds to which part? So I have 2 ways of doing this exercise. One is to actually write in my score. So I'll write, okay, this bar, okay, letter B in the exposition corresponds to letter K. But this time, the letter K didn't have flute solo, it has oboe solo instead, and it's shortened from 12 bars into 9 bars, something like that. Or the second thing that I sometimes use is to write out an abstract chart. So I will write out a structure and I'll post it on social media as some score studying tips throughout August as well. So I will write out a chart mostly to compare things. So I have the first statement on the top of my notebook and the reprise at the bottom. So I compare them and write out some key elements. So like which key we're in, what instrument, what material, is the material repeated or ornamented or like in variation form. So this comparison is something that I learned from Miguel Harth-Bedoya that I found really useful and was kind of new to me. I always knew there are differences, but I didn't single this thing out to study. And the next thing that I learned from Miguel is to be really, really, really particular about transposing instruments. Really know what's their sounding pitch, especially for French horns. When you see horn in B flat, is that a bass B flat or is the like alto B flat? And what note should the horn player play on their instrument in order to get that sound, right? So if there's in B flat, when they see a C on their sheet music, they have to play on an F, but the sounding pitch is B flat. But which B flat is a B flat going up or going down? So really, really know what pitches are involved. The sounding pitch, the notes they need to play on their instruments, and the rhythm pitch. And he would challenge us to write out list of all the keys that's being used, say, for a symphony. So in the first movement, the horns are in E and F. The trumpet are in E. The second movement, there is no trumpets. The horns are in F. The third movement, the horns are in C, and just making things up. But have a chart at the beginning of the piece for all the transposing instruments, clarinets, horns, trumpets, if you're in orchestra. And if there are any additional instruments, like piccolo, English horn, bass clarinet, some other things at the beginning of the piece, just to have a reference. So now I've shared some tips that were given to me by different teachers. The dynamic chart have 3 adjectives for each session, know the harmonic structure and write out each chord, and have a comparison of the repeated materials, and really know the sounding pitches and rhythm pitches and what they're playing with transposing instruments. Now, there are some things that I would like to explore when I have a lot of time that might not have direct impact on how I'm going to conduct. A teacher told me this, knowing Mozart wrote this piece when he was touring in Prague doesn't change how I conducted it, or doesn't change how I'm going to select the tempo. Yes, maybe, but I'm a person who likes to read and likes to know more about it. And I think the more you know, the more study you do, the more research you have done, helps you in general to be a better musician and to know the pieces more. So when I have a lot of time, I like to read about the context of how this piece was composed. What else did the composer wrote around this time? Were the composers working on several projects at the same time? Maybe she was writing an opera and used some of the materials while she wrote the symphony, or she took some of the ballet materials from and came up with this suite, or she had a piano trio and she transcribed this into an orchestra piece. Something like that. I love reading all about that. In my free time, when I'm not stressed having to go to rehearsal, I like to have list of composers' works and, of the same genre. So I would write out when did Tchaikovsky wrote all his symphonies, for example. And I'll list works composed around the same time, and also works in the same key by different composers. So, all the D minor important pieces, D minor or D major violin concertos, you will find some similarities. And, that's the number one thing that a composer decides when they are composing, right? They have to decide which key this piece is to be in. Yeah, and then I would have a log of works of similar instrumentations just for my future programming purposes. And as I talked about how I program in episode 46, it's important if you don't always have the full forces. So I would have a list of the pieces without low brass for orchestra or pieces with choirs. And I also have a list of things with different themes and similar themes. So say, okay, these are natural related. Those pieces are related to heroes and, like fight for freedoms. These pieces are related to water, for example. So I have different groups of list of repertoire, and that's part of my score study. And I'll write them on the cover page, or where the instrumentation is, write them just as reference. So next time if I open this score after 5 years, I will be reminded, so and so also wrote a similar piece in the same key. That might be something for reference. So here we go. I've touched on what I do when I don't have enough time, and also some tips that you can mix and match when you have time to really study. Next, I would like to share some of the highlights from our Girls Who Conduct Discovery Friday series. So before wrapping up today's episode, I wanted to share with you some highlights from our Girls Who Conduct Discovery Friday series. Our two ambassadors who graduate from our first cohort of the high school and college mentorship program, Amanda and Helena, have been working really hard on the social media post. They contacted a lot of the conductors and asked them to share their tips on score study and rehearsal strategy. And here I like to share some of my favorite ones. The first is from Tianyi Lu. She talks about how her dancing experience and training helps her to walk around, especially in nature, and move her body along when she studies the music. So she can actually feel the music with her own body. The next is from Holy Zhou. She talks about it's so important to check what's next after you turn a page. Sometimes it's a key change, sometimes it's a new section, or it can be instrument entering after a long rest. You want to write it before you turn the page, kind of as a reminder. This is something like so simple and so little, but a lot of people forget. And this is also I always write out if there's a new rehearsal letter once I turn a page. So, if I know once I turn a page, it goes to letter C, I can tell my players we are coming from 4 before C instead of, 25 after B. So write out what's happening next after you turn the page from Holy Zhou. The next is from Lucia Sickles. She gave a lot of tips about score study. I think there were some 10 of them, but the one that's my favorite is to play on the piano and sing each part. I don't always do that, to be honest, because I usually can hear the pitches and the sound in my mind when I look at this music. But when the harmony is weird or when it's a transposing instrument, I try to do that, to play it on the piano if I need. Or, sometimes if you just need to hear the right pitch, there are some apps with a keyboard that gives you the pitch as a reference. And so you can sing the line. And I think it's really important. The next comes from Meg, who is my mentor when I was in the mentorship program with the Maestra organization, which is an organization founded by Georgia Sid to support women and non-binary musicians working in musical theater mostly. But she talks about in musical theater, and I think that applies in opera and some other things as well, to analyze the orchestration for connection with the characters. So really understand how the instrumental writing supports the characters, supports the voices. If the character's emotion changes, is the emotion coming from the text, from the vocal line, or even from the orchestral accompaniment? That's something to bear in mind. The next comes from Kira Omechenko. She talks about sing and breathe with your wings, the brass, and vocal parts. So really know where they might be needing a break for breathing. That's super important. And something that I am guilty of as a string player. I don't always think about that in my planning. That's something I need to remind myself many, many times. And the last but not least comes from Julia Baumanis. She shares 5S plan for score study. And the last one is just select. So make a rehearsal plan and select objectives for rehearsal. So after you cleanse, you seek, you sing, and you have better understanding, you make a rehearsal plan. These are just examples of our wonderful social media posts, and there are a lot more that I invite you to check them out if you haven't already. And I hope you found something useful or something that's kind of reviewing for you, something that's maybe you knew or some exercise that you've been doing for a while or you did in the past and not anymore. But my hope is to provide some more ideas for you to try. If you don't like some of them, it's totally fine. Like, I'm a very structural person. So if I don't have enough time after tempo, transition, balance, the first thing I go through is structure. But this is not the same for everyone. For some people, the key changes is the most important thing. Or some people, the pacing is the most important thing. Or for some other people, entrances or phrase structure are the most important thing that they go through. It doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that you have different ways of doing things. And score study is such an art that we can always improve. When we are starting out, we might be just focusing on the treble and the bass line. And then more and more you can look into the instrumentation and learn the harmonic changes, the harmonic pacing. But it's such a beautiful thing. My friend Lydia Yampovskaya recently shared on social media that she opened a score that she studied many, many years ago and saw her own old note of beating into or stop here, that kind of thing when she was still less experienced. That's the beauty of it. And I still keep my notes from master classes, from different teachers, from different conducting experience. And the more you do it, the better we get. And it's such a great, fun journey. Thank you so much again for listening today. I hope you're having a great day. I will see you next time, next week at the same time, same place. Bye for now.